Hey everybody, it's that Sunday School Girl of thatsundayschoolgirl.com. Welcome to the lesson for this Sunday, November 19th. I do hope you had a wonderful week. Mine has been busy. I think I'm on the verge of being tired. I probably look tired, but I've done a lot today and my night is still going. But I wanted to pause and make sure that we had our time to ensure that you are ready for Sunday school. Before we get into the lesson, I just want to share personally that it was a wonderful week. I am so excited that today ended our 2-week 27th annual Black Law Student Association food drive at the University of Kansas School of Law. And it was incredible to watch our law school community come together for 2 weeks to impact hunger in our community and two surrounding communities. So it was fantastic. We ended the drive at 4 o'clock today. The trucks were there by 4:30, 5 o'clock, and we got all of those loaded up. Some of us did manual labor and broke a sweat today. It was a lot of fun, though, and I appreciate the community of people around me who helped to make that happen. So it has been a full day, and I wish I could tell it all. Just know that for me, it's about 9:30 at night, but the night is still young. I hope that you have great things planned for this weekend. And yes, I hope that that does include Sunday school. Hey, if you're new around here, welcome. You have just joined the largest cyber community of Sunday school students on the World Wide Web, and I am thrilled that you're here. Do me a favor, say hello to me in the comments down below, and I want to know how you found the channel. And most of all, make sure that you hit the subscribe button and hit the notifications button so that you don't miss any of the great content that comes out on this channel. In the spirit of content and being a resource to Sunday school teachers, workers, students from all over, I want to invite you tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time. 11 o'clock Central Time. I'll be in a different time zone, but 11 o'clock Central on my Facebook Live. I promised you last quarter that I would start to do a quarterly training and that I would work to target the month prior to our new quarterly study. So we start a new quarter in December, and so we're working to provide training for you in the month of November. We're going to focus tomorrow on children and youth classes, and I've got a couple of great guests who are going to join me for just a few minutes. But it is also really just your time to ask questions and let's engage with each other personally. So if you teach children's classes or youth classes and you would love to spend that time with me, please join me at 11 a.m. Central on my Facebook for That Sunday School Girl. So if you're not friends with the page, you want to go ahead, actually just like the page, hit the like button so that you'll get that notification as well. And again, that will be a live interactive format. If you've got questions that you want to submit, you can either email me at thatsundayschoolgirl@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment on my Facebook wall, Facebook inbox. But if there's something that you want me to address, let me know. And if not, we'll be interacting and you can ask questions during the time that we are together. So I'm excited to be with you all. I love the live question format and it's going to be great. I think that's really all that I wanted to share for now. Why don't we get into the lesson? Our lesson title is An Everlasting Covenant. The Bible basis is Hebrews chapter 12, verses 14 through 29. The Bible truth. The writer of Hebrews proclaims that Jesus provides the means needed to boldly approach the presence of God. Our memory verse is verse 28. And the lesson aim is that we will consider the meaning of the Bible's teaching that God is a consuming fire, repent for our lack of holiness, and celebrate Jesus as the mediator who brings us into God's presence. The lesson this week takes us to the book of Hebrews for our study. The writer is addressing a group of Christians who have really suffered. They've had their property stolen, they've been beaten, imprisoned, others have been killed for the cause of Christ, and many of us have a really hard time getting our minds around that level of suffering because we really haven't experienced anything like it. The writer chooses not to identify himself, but he was obviously well known to the recipients of the letter. Chapter 11 of Hebrews gives us what we know as the Hall of Faith, listing those who are called the great cloud of witnesses who knew firsthand of God's mercy and his grace. And chapter 11 talks about the suffering, particularly of the prophets, for the cause of Christ. It wasn't a celebrity, glamorous, sexy kind of role, but they suffered for the cause of Christ. And here, Jesus is also noted in chapter 12, around verse 1, verse 2, he is noted as the greatest. He is the author and the finisher of our faith. And the example of Jesus Christ is the greatest of all suffering because his sacrifice took him to the cross to die for our sin, the giving of his life and the shedding of his blood. So this theme in chapter 12 is that it's all about what we do for Jesus. It's really using the metaphor of a race. In verses 1 through 4, there was hope given to the Jew that some Hebrews were thinking about going back to the old system, and they were not confident in the message of grace. And so there is a message of hope that's given. The writer points to Jesus again in verses 1 through 3. In verses 5 through 13, he assures them of God's love. In verses 14 through 29, we see the power of grace given by God, and that's really the focus of our lesson. So again, you have this writer who is writing to a group who believed that their best option at this point was in the old world with their old rituals, encouraging them that that's really not what you wanted to do. He wanted them to hold on to their faith and remain faithful to God. In this lesson, we'll see that we'll find out Jesus is our mediator. We're going to talk about what that means. But he is reminding them basically of the covenant, the theme of our quarter, the covenant that they have with God. We pick up in verse 14, and it starts with the word that is an imperative. It's a command. Follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. Now, in the verses above, you find out that this has been a very challenging time. They've also experienced God's chastening. And coming out of that, as a result of, going through an experience with God, there are just ways that people of God are to act. And so when we jump kind of in the middle of the movie on this one, he's talking about looking at what we know. We have a responsibility as a result of what we know. Keeping in context again that this writer is talking to converts about how to navigate through difficult situations, difficult landscapes, difficult people. He wasn't able to promise that they wouldn't face additional difficulties or that things would change immediately, that they were going to get better. He didn't even negate their responsibility as believers. He says, this is what you're supposed to do. You have to follow peace. You follow peace with all men, and not just follow peace. You've also got to be holy. Now, I talk about this often, that being a Christian is about so much more than just an initial commitment of your faith. It's not the fact that you attend regular services or that you wear t-shirts or bumper stickers or that you have a legacy in ministry or that you hold a position in the church, but it's really about how we act, how we respond in our everyday lives. The fact that we have this obligation to represent God every day in everything that we do. And that includes even the most difficult times, which again is where these people found themselves, in the middle of a difficult time. And I challenge myself often, and even people around me, when I look at how we instinctively respond to things. And I challenge us to look at, does this really line up with the way we represent as teachers, the way we represent as people who serve in ministry, the way that we represent as people who say that we are Christian. And so it's important that we honor God in the ways that we behave. And the writer acknowledges that every situation is not going to be easy, but you are commanded to be peaceable with all men, even the ones you don't like, even the ones you don't get along with, even the ones in their cases who were persecuting them. They were to find a way. Follow is this idea, not just like to follow behind something passively, but to follow and pursue hard, to really, really work at it. And again, not just peace, but holiness, to pursue personal peace, pursue a life of sanctification, being set apart for God's use. Holiness is still right, and we are to pursue holiness. And if you look at this particular scripture, without it, if we don't have it, absent holiness in our lives, we cannot see God. And so here, again, the writer is encouraging them, follow peace and be holy. I heard Pastor John Hanna say this week, just in terms of living holy and addressing sin in our own lives, that sin is looking for an opportunity to embarrass you. And so we have to be active in maintaining the spaces around us and making sure that we are being intentional about following peace and following hard after holiness. And then he goes on to say, you're looking diligently lest any man fail of the grace of God. Again, he's speaking to people who are considering going back, turning back. For them, it's too hard. It's not worth it anymore. They just want to go back to what they knew, what was comfortable, and that was being guided and instructed by the law. But he says, looking intently, lest we reject the gift that's been given to us. And what was that gift? The gift was the gift of grace, that the law was no longer their guide, but the message of grace, of God's love. It was God's grace that saved them, and it was a gift from God. And anytime someone has given you a gift, it's hurtful to the giver if you don't accept that gift, because they've taken time. They thought about you. They thought about what you enjoy. They thought about something you collect. When they saw it, they thought about you and thought it would benefit you in some way. And so to reject a gift is very hurtful to the giver. In essence, it would make grace a failure. It would snub the very sacrifice on the cross. It would be like turning your nose up at the cross to not accept the gift that God had given. In essence, again, it would negate the work on the cross. And so the writer is careful to acknowledge that although they've been through a difficult journey, they've experienced God's chastening, which is not easy. Like to go through those hard points where God is cleaning us up and getting the ugly things out of us and working things through us in our lives. It's tough, but the writer says, don't let that be a thing that produces bitterness in you. And it's particularly the root of bitterness. Now, today, I'm having a root issue. There is some funny business going on at the house, and I literally have had to have a tree taken out of the backyard because the roots have gotten out of control and they're going into places and spaces that they shouldn't and starting to cause a threat even to the foundation of the home. And so you have to watch the roots of things, because roots, we don't see them. I'm thinking about the issues at the house. I didn't see it. I didn't know it because the tree has been back there for double-digit years. But underneath the ground, the root is growing and it's pushing its way into places and things that it shouldn't be. And that's the analogy that we get with this root of bitterness, that you have to watch the root of bitterness, because what starts in your mind ultimately ends up in your heart, and you have to watch it because it becomes paralyzing and damaging. And so the writer is encouraging them not to look on their experience in a way that causes them to become bitter. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. Here, there's a segue now. We're going into verses 17 through, I think, 21. And we're going to be looking at this contrast of the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. We're looking at two different experiences. So there are two mountains that you're going to see in the rest of the writing. There's Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. The first that we see is Sinai, where the law was given to Moses. If you read the text, you're going to see that in this contrast, we've even studied these. We studied both the law given to Moses, and I think last week we did the New Covenant. And as we looked at the experience on Sinai, we saw that it was a very colorful scene. This was 90 days or so, 3 months after the children of Israel have been freed from bondage, and they are in the wilderness and they come to the foot of Sinai. I'm not going to give you the whole lesson. You can go back and grab those videos if you missed them. But Moses is their leader, and Moses goes up to the top of the mountain and he speaks to God. Moses has a relationship with God, and God has an interaction with Moses and the children of Israel. But if you remember Exodus 19 and 20, the scene there was strange and it was eventful and it was sensory sights and sounds. There was a lot going on. And in that time, the moral law was given to them on Sinai. But here in this text, we see you haven't come to that mountain. That's not where you are. And again, the writer is talking to people who now make a confession in Jesus Christ. So he's saying, you're not at that mountain receiving that law. And they needed to be reminded of what happened, like to long for the old country and everything that was going on. He had to remind them of that experience in the Old Testament. And we talked about how dreadful and terrible that experience was, again, to the darkness of the cloud that God was in, the voice, the thunderous voice, the sound of the trumpet, I'm sure the people, the noise of the people. So there was a lot going on, and the writer's really saying, is that what you want to go back to? So you haven't come to this mountain. The writer is saying, remember what was there. There was fire. There was smoke. Remember the sights and the sound. It was loud. And remember your response. The people responded, this is too much for us. Moses, listen, you go up there and talk to God, and you come back and you tell us what he said, because his voice is just too much for us. You'll even remember that they were not even allowed to approach the mountain in a common manner. There was a distance that they had to stay back. The people could not endure what was going on in that experience. They could not approach a holy God in their own sinful circumstances. And the writer even talks about Moses' own personal experience, that Moses, who had a direct and personal relationship with God, he talked with God. Even he was fearful and trembling in this experience with the holy God. And so he reminds them that it was a time of panic and terror. And the giving of the law really served to expose man to see his own sinfulness. It was a reminder for anyone who needed to recall exactly what it meant to go back. It would mean that same experience. He says, but you're not there. Verse 22 gives us the contrast. He says, you're not there, but that means something is different. But you are come to Mount Zion. You're not there anymore on Sinai. Now you have Jesus in your life. You've come to Mount Zion, which is the heavenly city. It's a holy city. It was the high point of Jerusalem, a strong city. It represented security. David wrote about Mount Zion. He said that great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, in the mountain of his holiness. The whole earth is Mount Zion. And in Mount Zion, it brought them into the presence of God. Now, it was a place where they were redeemed. It was a place that existed for their safety and their security. And in this new covenant, we learned this last week, this place was forever. Reading the lesson, we see that they are in the company of a glorious group. Who is this glorious group? It is a number of angels. Innumerable is what the lesson says, meaning that comes from the Greek word where we get the word myriad, meaning so many, tens of thousands of angels. And we are redeemed and brought into the presence of God and the presence of angels. And God did this because he wanted relationship, because he loved us. Verse 23 talks about to the general assembly and the church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and the spirits of just men made perfect. He's describing the people here who live with him forever. And when we're looking at this reference of the gathering of the gathering of a general assembly, it's like a public feast in a Jewish culture. The General Assembly is really a gathering of joy versus the terror that we talked about back in Exodus 20. So this gathering is a celebration, and it's a celebration with angels. The angels are there. The church is there. And then verse 24 tells us, and Jesus is there. And who is Jesus? He is the mediator. And we know that a mediator, if you took time to look it up, hopefully you pulled out your dictionary, is a go-between. That person who was between man and between God to make the relationship easier. Now, one of my favorite classes this semester is my family mediation class. And it is very interesting to sit in between two parties who see things differently and process differently, and to be the one who helps to settle that conversation and to help both sides learn to speak to each other and come out with something that is productive for all sides. And so Jesus is that person who makes communication with God safer, more safe. So it's not the terrorizing experience from Mount Sinai. And it also it's a way that gives us, again, that bridge for relationship with God. It removed the need to have, earthly men serving as priests, because here we had Jesus himself who was able to be our mediator. And it says, Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and the blood of sprinkling that speaketh better than of Abel. Abel's referenced here. If you go back to Genesis chapter 4, verse 10, the blood of Abel cries out from the ground. And the blood of Jesus, in essence, cries out as well from Calvary, but it's not the same cry from the ground. When Abel's blood cried out, it was for vengeance. But when the blood of Jesus cried out for us, it was about grace. And so when we compare and contrast, again, these two experiences, these two different covenants, we see that the old covenant brought fear, the new one brought faith. The old one brought death, the new covenant brought life. The old covenant enslaved and left man imperfect. The new covenant makes man free and it covers his sins. The old covenant didn't bring life, and the new covenant does bring life. The old covenant was about works and the law, and the new covenant is about grace. The old covenant, again, I mentioned this, was about earthly priests and a system of sacrifice. But with the new covenant, we have a heavenly priest. And as we saw last week, the old covenant was written on tablets of stone. But the new covenant is written on our hearts. And we ended last week's lesson with knowing that that is signed by God. We have his signature on us. The writer goes on to implore them, don't ignore what you're hearing. Don't reject this message. You can't act like you haven't heard this. It's not like you don't know the consequences. There were instructions laid out at Sinai. There were ways to approach the mountain, not to get too close to God. God even shrouded himself in a cloud because they couldn't handle it. And there were consequences for those who did not follow the rules that were laid out. Just the same, there are consequences for those who resist the work of Mount Zion, who resist the message of grace. So he says, don't refuse the one who is speaking. And who is the one that is speaking? We don't want to refuse Jesus. And why don't we want to refuse him? If you read down between verses 25 and 29, I believe it is, you're going to see three reasons. The first is that there is no escape for those who close off their minds to Jesus Christ, who close off their minds to the message of grace. Secondly, there is no escape from future judgment. And the last thing that we see in verses 28 and 29 is that we receive a kingdom kept by grace. And so this contrast again in these voices, the person who speaks on earth versus the person who we see speaking in heaven. The person who spoke on earth, the one uses God's mouthpiece. Since we've been contrasting these experiences on the mountain, the person who spoke on earth is Moses. And Moses was God's spokesperson. But he's contrasted with Jesus, who speaks from heaven. He doesn't need a spokesperson. He is the real voice. And if people heard and trusted and obeyed the voice of Moses, how much more are we expected to hear and obey the voice of Jesus? Verse 26 tells us that God's voice shakes things up at Sinai. And it's not just the mountain that's shaken, but it is heaven. But this new covenant cannot be shaken. It is unshakable. And other things will pass away, but this covenant remains forever. And that's really been the crux of our lesson, is that this covenant that we have as God's people, it's forever. And he then wraps up his argument in verse 28, starts with the word wherefore. That's when you know a wrap up is coming. That's his, I'm getting ready to close. Wherefore, by receiving a kingdom which cannot be moved, let us have grace, whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. Since we have this unshakable kingdom, let's keep grace. Let's stay where we are. Let's not go back. Let's present ourselves in a way that's acceptable for God, and let's move forward. Let's pursue God and after him and accept the grace that he's given to us. And the reason is because our God is a consuming fire. And again, this is his final plea for anyone who's really not convinced. I wrote down in my notes, it reminded me of the color purple. Don't do it, Miss Seeley. Don't go back. Don't trade places with where I've been. Don't go back. Don't change your mind. Don't even think about hurting the giver of the gift. Don't think about making God angry and being on the receiving end of his judgment. This is our lesson for the week. Here are my key learnings, and there are just a few this week. First, don't forsake true relationship with God for systems and rituals and things and other people's voices, but learn to pursue, through the grace of God, your own relationship with God. He wants that with each and every one of us. And no matter what he's taken us out of, brought us out of, delivered us from, even when things get difficult, it's not better on the other side. We need to continue to follow hard after God, following peace with all men and pursuing holiness even in our own lives. And there's a message there as well that holiness is still right. He's still calling us to lives of sanctification, being set apart for his use. We are not like everyone. We are not common, but these lessons have come to tell us, to remind us that God considers us his special people. And so we can't mix with everything. Holiness does not allow us to be a part of any and everything going on. Lastly, what we have with God is everlasting. It can't be taken from us. It's the gift he's given to us, and it is everlasting. This is all for the week. Thank you all for being with me. You likely won't see me again before we all sit down to turkey and dressing, so I want to say happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Travel safely if you're traveling. Enjoy your family. Eat lots. Cheer for the right football team. Do all of that. But most of all, make sure that you remember all of the things that we have to be thankful for. Take time to spend some time with God and just enjoy the great blessings that he has given to each and every one of us. That's all. Everybody have a super fantastic weekend. I hope to see you tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Central on the Facebook Live. Otherwise, I will see you in Sunday school. Bye, everybody.